At the start of the classic 1939 MGM musical, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, our heroine, Dorothy Gale, played by Judy Garland, is trying to escape from the mean and powerful Miss Gulch. Miss Gulch wants to take away Dorothy's beloved dog Toto for digging up Miss Gulch's flower bed and biting her. When Dorothy gets home, she finds that no one cares much about her problem. Soon Miss Gulch arrives with a sheriff's order entitling her to take Toto away to be destroyed. Dorothy's aunt and uncle are powerless to protect Toto. But fortunately, Toto escapes Miss Gulch and returns to the distraught Dorothy. The two run away. Dorothy soon has a change of heart, though, and returns home only to find a tornado bearing down on the farm. Flying debris knocks her unconscious as the storm approaches, and so begins her fantastical journey to the land of Oz. It ends when Dorothy wakes to find her family and Toto gathered around her bedside. "We thought we'd almost lost you there for a minute," they tell her. She tries to tell them briefly about the vivid dream she had, but they don't understand, and she settles back in her bed, happy to be home. The movie ends. But what will happen when Miss Gulch returns? Wonderful as the movie is, and it is a treasure, isn't it? It never actually solves Dorothy's problem. Toto remains in danger, and unlike the Land of Oz, Dorothy can't just make her adversary go away. One of the most challenging negotiation problems is dealing with someone who seems overwhelmingly powerful. We often face counterparts like that, and at such times they can seem to us to be like Godzilla, that famous 1950s movie monster who stood dozens of feet tall and endlessly terrorized Tokyo. Like Godzilla, your counterpart may be someone who can squash you, someone who can easily ignore you or dictate terms. When you're faced with a Godzilla, what do? Should you try to negotiate at all? What hope do you have? Similarly difficult is dealing with someone who seems evil or who's an existential enemy, a devil incarnate. Should you negotiate with Hitler, terrorists, hostage takers, enemies who have sworn to destroy you? Sometimes the answer is simple. You may have to fight your enemy. You may have to accept a very weak deal from your Godzilla. But there are good ways to decide whether and how to negotiate with those who seem like devils. And there are good ways to negotiate, influence, and even lead Godzillas. In this session, we'll explore the answers to those challenges. Let's begin by looking at the challenge of negotiating with a Godzilla. Let's acknowledge at the start that someone can be a Godzilla without being mean or unfair. He might just be incredibly powerful. With that in mind, I'd like to share a story with you about a 17-year-old high school student named Steve Ortiz. Someone gave Steve a used cell phone when he was 15. He traded that phone for an iPod, the iPod for a series of dirt bikes, a dirt bike for a MacBook Pro, the MacBook Pro for a 1987 Toyota 4Runner, the Toyota for a souped-up golf cart, the golf cart for a 1975 Ford Bronco, and the Bronco for a 2000 Porsche Boxster. Now, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine that 15-year-old Steve had approached the Porsche owner when all Steve had was a cell phone and had asked to make him a trade. The Porsche owner would have been tempted to laugh in his face. "Look, Steve, you're just a kid, and you almost had nothing." Fast forward a couple of years, and somehow Steve is a credible trading partner. In fact, he slightly traded down for the Porsche. The Ford Bronco may have been worth slightly more money. Steve's story illustrates the power of making moves away from the table to improve your ability to deal with the Godzilla at the table. The idea is simple and powerful. Instead of dealing directly with the Godzilla when you're weak, you instead gather strength by first doing a series of prior negotiations with others that make you stronger and more attractive, or both. In Steve's case, he made himself much more attractive by making trades until he had a very valuable item to offer. In other cases, a negotiator might do a series of trades that give him a much better alternative to agreement. For example, trading a pea shooter for a BB gun for a crossbow for a bazooka. In some cases, a negotiator can do both. The power of moves away from the table is not a new insight. In Of Negotiating, the very first English writing ever published about how to negotiate, Sir Francis Bacon concluded with this statement: "In all negotiations of difficulty, a man may not look to sow and reap at once, but must prepare business, and so ripen it by degrees." Bacon was speaking about the power of preparation generally, but notice that he was particularly highlighting the connection between difficult talks and a gradual approach. The bigger your Godzilla, the better your chance of dealing with him if you ripen your preparation by degrees. And that's what Steve Ortiz did. He ripened his Porsche negotiation by degrees with a series of moves away from the table. Let's see how you might use moves away from the table to save and secure an important business venture when you're a weak entrepreneur and you're up against a tower of power. In his excellent book, Breakthrough Business Negotiation, former Harvard business professor Michael Watkins presents a story about a small real estate developer named Claire. Claire is trying to create a shopping mall in Fairfield, Massachusetts. She's been having trouble negotiating with Bargain Mart, a huge discount retailer that Claire wants as an anchor tenant. Claire has one month left on an option from a landowner to develop a piece of land in Fairfield. The local government is business-friendly and even advertises its willingness to give tax breaks and improvements for business development, but so far hasn't done very much. A bank has tentatively agreed to lend Claire money, and a number of satellite tenants are interested in renting space if Bargain Mart commits. But Claire has problems. Though early talks with Bargain Mart went well, its lead negotiator, Eric, started to increase pressure on her. He demanded a very low rent, which Claire can't afford, and freedom to transfer the lease to another firm. He also wanted his company to have freedom to use the space any way it wished, clauses that would cause the bank to cancel its loan and that would scare off the satellite tenants. Eric also asked for the right to sublet, which would make the satellite tenants very unhappy. Claire feels even more pressure because she skipped talking to Bargain Mart's rival, Value Shops. Bargain Mart is her only major prospect. What can Claire do now? As Watkins recommends, a wise strategy would be for Claire to make a series of moves away from the table. To do that, Claire should answer two simple questions. First, what deals can I make with others that can help me offer more attractive options to Bargain Mart and that can help me have better alternatives to agreement? Also, or second, she should ask, in what order should I make these deals, in the hopes that one might help me do the next one and the next, and so on? Claire decides to first negotiate with the local government. She tells them this: "You advertised that you'll give tax breaks and improvements to business developers. If you can give me those soon, my mall can help you get improved sales tax revenue, improved property tax revenue, increase local employment, and help you keep a promise to support local development." That's a compelling argument, and the local government readily agrees. Claire has her first win. With tax breaks and improvements in hand, she next turns to the landowner. She tells him about the new government deal and asks him to extend the option deadline and lower the rent. If we agree, she says, you get valuable government improvements to your land that will increase its value. We can share savings from the tax breaks, and you get a more viable mall on your land with clear government support. That too is a compelling case, and the landowner readily agrees. Claire has her second win. Then Claire goes to the bank. She tells her banker about the deals with the government and the landowner. Then she asks for two things: a lower interest rate and more flexibility to make concessions with Bargain Mart. Since I've won valuable improvements, tax breaks, and rent reductions, the mall will be much more valuable now, and my projected cash flow will be better. So if we agree, you get a more valuable collateral, a more attractive borrower, and a more viable mall. Because Claire has made herself and her project much more attractive to the bank, her banker, too, agrees to her requests. She is her third win. Now she turns to the top satellite stores. She tells them about her recent wins and asks them to rent space in her mall even if she makes more concessions to the anchor tenant. She says this, "Thanks to agreements I've recently struck with the government, the landowner, and the bank, I can offer you a lower rent, and the mall is even stronger financially than before. But I need your help. Will you work with me?" With her more attractive offer, Claire wins the flexibility she needs from the satellites. She is her fourth win. Now she turns to value shops to discuss the possibility that they might serve as the anchor tenant instead of Bargain Mart. While I am seriously considering Bargain Mart as a tenant, she tells him truthfully, these talks may fall through. And if they do, you can replace your arch rival at a very attractive new mall. Value Shops is strongly interested and makes an attractive offer to serve as the anchor tenant. Now, finally, Claire returns to Eric of Bargain Mart. Here's what she says. I'm now in a position to make a new proposal. Thanks to a number of other agreements I've worked out in the last few weeks, I can offer you a lower rent and permission to sometimes transfer the lease. In return, I'd like you to agree to a limited right to sublet. With respect, I should mention that I also have recently gotten strong interest from value shops. If you and I agree, you get a more attractive site, a lower rent, and a more viable mall than I first proposed. If Eric presses her, she could tactfully point out a concern. If we don't agree, it's not clear Bargain Mart will find as good a mall elsewhere in the region, and it may have to settle for worse satellite stores, and its arch rival may well take its place. As Watkin notes, by making a series of moves away from the table, Claire has made herself more strong and attractive. Bargain Mart is still strong, but it's no longer a Godzilla. It would be very wise to agree to Claire's terms. Notice that the I foresaw it can help you plan moves away from the table. Claire identified players away from the table who could help her negotiate better. For each, she identified key interests she could satisfy and key interests she had that they could satisfy. Her factual research helped her master arcane but important facts like government policy and the financial effects of different deal terms. In each case, she crafted creative options, deal terms, that served people's interests. She also sequenced or scheduled the meetings so that each success increased her chances with the next player and the next. And she similarly thought about ways to negotiate to improve her alternatives to agreement. How then might moves away from the table help Dorothy the day after she awoke from her visit to Oz? To save Toto, she needs to negotiate very wisely. Here's one possible scenario. As soon as she feels well enough, Dorothy develops a plan and discusses it with her family, and then walks into town and visits the local newspaper editor. She tells him the story of how Toto helped save her by staying with her during the storm and calling for help until her family found her. She suggests a headline that the editor likes, "Hero Dog Saves Girl from Twister." Then, if asked, she could add, off the record, "It's true Miss Gulch has an order to take Toto away because he gets into her yard, but I'm committed to avoiding her yard from now on. I know Miss Gulch cares a lot about the county and wants it to recover, and I know she'd be sad if news came out later that my hero dog suffered because of an unfortunate misunderstanding. I know she and I can be friends about these things." As soon as that report is underway, Dorothy could walk across the street to the local farmers' cooperative and tell the head of it about the upcoming news story. She can encourage the co-op to use the article to promote the county's pluck, courage, and determination, as embodied by a small, adorable dog. "What do you think?" she might ask. "Do you think that little Toto could be a symbol of our recovery? I wonder if he could focus public attention and imagination on a recovery. I'd love your advice." That question could open up a wise possibility because historically public response to distant calamity has often turned on a human interest story that captures the public's imagination. In this way, Dorothy could convince the co-op to immediately send copies of the article to other newspapers far and wide, to state and federal legislators, and wealthy benefactors. She could also ask the co-op's head to accompany her to the next meeting. With the co-op's enthusiastic agreement, the two could then cross the street to the local bank. Together, they could encourage the banker to delay pressing farmers for debt payments for the next few weeks, since the Toto campaign might help the region win good press and eventually new investment in the county. The co-op official's enthusiastic support would add credibility to Dorothy's idea. In fact, she could even ask him to pitch it. Even if the banker says no, which is quite possible, they could ask him to ease credit later if the campaign starts to work. That option might make it easy for the banker to say yes. Now Dorothy could seek out Miss Gulch without Toto. She might first ask how Miss Gulch and her family are doing after the awful storm. She might then apologize for hurting Miss Gulch's flower garden, which now seems like a trivial injury after the storm. She might then promise to avoid Miss Gulch's house in the future and keep Toto leashed if necessary. Then she could share the good news about the Toto article and the Toto campaign, and the good it's already begun to do for the county's economy, which Miss Gulch half owns. Dorothy probably won't need to tell Miss Gulch that if Miss Gulch comes for Toto now, the news coverage might make it impossible. But Dorothy should be ready to gently note that if she must. In these ways, Dorothy could melt Miss Gulch, not by destroying her, but by addressing her needs for respect, compassion, protection, economic recovery, and good press, by creating a strong BATNA, and by creating a compelling proposal thanks to her moves away from the table. In effect, she's developed the brain, heart, and courage she needs to be as savvy as a serpent, as harmless as a dove. Let's admit quickly that this is a thought experiment and that there's no guarantee that a 12-year-old girl could do such things. Still, we've seen a 15-year-old boy do remarkable negotiating. Beyond moves away from the table, there are several other ways to cope with the Godzilla. Another useful principle for dealing with Godzillas is to avoid all-or-nothing deals with them. Walmart, for example, famously offers suppliers huge orders that overnight can transform their businesses. But once a supplier becomes dependent on these orders, Walmart can readily demand price cuts in each succeeding round of talks, which can cripple or destroy the firm. A number of companies have had to shift their manufacturing to Asia just to accommodate Walmart. Ironically, when I teach in China, executives there ask me this question: how do we deal with Walmart? As Peter D. Johnston writes in his book Negotiating with Giants, Tom Droog faced this very challenge to his sunflower seed business when a Walmart buyer struck a deal with Tom's salesman to sell the seeds in some of its stores. 1 year later, seed sales to Walmart had reached $1 million annually. But sure enough, Walmart had already struck a hard bargain. Tom's company was making little profit and knew Walmart could very easily put pressure on Tom to cut prices further. So Tom politely requested a 15% increase, saying that without it, he would cancel further sales to Walmart. Walmart agreed to an 8% increase, but to everyone's shock, Tom walked away. But it wasn't a difficult decision, because Tom was making very little money and feared Walmart would totally dominate him. Happily, 6 months later, Walmart called back. Customer demand for the seeds was high, and Walmart offered a 15% increase. In a sense, Tom's power came from basic negotiation principles. He knew his interests, knew the details of his business, and foresaw time bombs in continuing with the Walmart deal. And he knew that his BATNA was acceptable. That last point about BATNA deserves further attention. How did Tom know his BATNA was acceptable? He clearly visualized it and did the math. Benjamin Franklin did something wise and similar in a similar situation. As he recounts in his autobiography, At one point in his early career as a printer, Franklin was close to going bankrupt because of poor sales. Then someone came to him and offered a large sum of money if Franklin would publish something that Franklin found morally repugnant. What to do? His counterpart was a Godzilla who could save him or leave him close to ruin. To solve the problem, Ben Franklin created a budget to find out how much he'd have to live on if the business failed. Then he put himself on that budget before he made the decision about the offer. He bought only food he could afford on the new budget and slept on the floor of his room. To his surprise, he found he could happily live that way. So he turned down the offer and struggled on until he was able to turn the business around by other means. In fact, most entrepreneurs would be wise to follow Ben Franklin and Tom Droog's examples. Conventional wisdom holds that an entrepreneur should raise as much money as possible as quickly as possible if she's going to make it. But studies show that one of the most likely causes of failure for entrepreneurs is raising too much capital too soon. In part, that's because entrepreneurs need time to make mistakes and change their business models early on at low cost before they've made huge financial commitments to a flawed idea. In part, that's because when they raise money too early, they must give away a large part of the business because the business is so unproven and risky. Raise too much money too early, and you could be wedding yourself to a Godzilla who can dominate your company and make it hard for you to learn things and change directions. A Harvard study found that 40% of the fastest growing startup companies in America one year got their start by using small amounts of money from their own savings and from a few friends and family members. They'd all avoided all or nothing deals with Godzilla investors. Even if you have no authority in a room full of Godzillas, you can still use basic negotiation principles to be powerfully influential. You can be the most junior person in the room and have no idea what the correct answer is to the group's problems, and yet still be a remarkably effective leader. That's because even there, you can exercise process leadership that can help a group reach wise decisions. How do you do that? In essence, by offering to facilitate discussions, set discussion ground rules, and act as a negotiation coach. When you do that, you can help bring out the wisdom of the well-debated consensus of the group. A student of mine, I'll call Bob, had seen several Christmases ruined by fights among his adult siblings. Each time, they'd fought over what gift to give their parents. Each time, they'd had an endless series of round-robin phone calls that worked so badly that often they wouldn't speak to each other for weeks after the holidays were over. Bob wanted a better Christmas, so he offered to host and facilitate a lunchtime gathering of the siblings, and they all agreed. After lunch, Bob suggested some simple discussion ground rules: no interrupting, civility, and other basic rules which they all agreed to. Then he invited each to speak in turn about past and present gift-giving. He highlighted common ground. He asked them to consider the consequences of going back to the old round-robin method, and then he invited them to brainstorm creative ideas. In less than an hour, they had come up with a novel solution to their troubles: have one sibling pick the gift each year with the financial support of the others. Then he gently pressed them to test the idea for time bombs, and that helped make the idea even better. When they were done, hugs and laughter followed, the first happy gift-giving experience they'd had in years. Bob had no authority, and his family seemed to him like a group of Godzillas. But by leading the process, he in effect coached his family to negotiate well, and so come to a wise, mutually satisfying solution. One caveat: when you put yourself in the middle and offer to facilitate a group, you're putting yourself in a politically dangerous place. Why? Because people may blame you for whatever happens at the meeting. So it's wise to decide whether the group needs your process leadership and whether somebody else can serve that role instead. If you decide you want to play that role, you may want to prepare well, treating the meeting as a negotiation and doing some I-foresaw-it planning. But your greatest strengths will be in your will lie in your ability to practice and model the simplest skills: listening, question asking, focusing on interest and options, and enforcing discussion rules. Okay, now let's turn to the problem of dealing with seemingly evil people like tyrants, hostage takers, and military enemies. Should you ever negotiate with them? No, yes, and maybe. The quintessential argument against such negotiation is British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his experience conceding much of Czechoslovakia to Hitler at the Munich Conference in October 1938, an event that proved to be the eve of World War II. This appeasement strategy proved disastrous when Hitler abrogated the treaty and invaded Poland the following year. Ever since, perhaps somewhat unfairly, leaders have treated Chamberlain as a cautionary tale. They've used him to justify a non-negotiation stance with adversaries. A tough, militaristic stance often seems like the only approach in a hard world. So it may be surprising that the U.S. Military Academy at West Point actually has a well-established program on negotiation. That program has had important success teaching cadets to negotiate with combatants in the field. That's a clue that an absolute prohibition against negotiation with enemies may simply be unwise. But Harvard negotiating professor Robert Mnookin makes this point in his book, Bargaining with the Devil. As he notes, while you shouldn't always negotiate with evil people, we should probably at least engage with them more often than we first think. That's because we naturally tend to demonize those we don't know, don't understand, and disagree with. That tendency kills the possibility for discovering surprises, for learning things, and for sometimes diffusing a seemingly intractable conflict. One sign that Mnookin is onto something is the New York Police Department hostage negotiation team's success in negotiating with hostage takers. We've seen their remarkable success before in this course. Before the 1970s, hostage negotiations by police were virtually unheard of. Today, hundreds of similar programs exist around the world. As the New York Police Department has learned, the longer you talk with the hostage taker, the less the chance he'll do something violent, and the greater the chance things will end peacefully. But doesn't the willingness to negotiate encourage and embolden hostage takers? Isn't it true that you never say no to a hostage taker in such situations? No. In fact, hostage takers say no to hostage negotiators say no to hostage takers all the time. How they say it, though, is important. I understand that you want a plane to take you to Cuba. I don't know if I can get that for you anytime soon, but I can get you some pizza, and I want to hear your story. That said, there are real moral disasters that can arise from negotiating with villains. First, negotiation can help legitimize the villain. He must have some importance if the feds are talking to him. Also, negotiation can undermine the strength of internal opposition. One of the tragedies of Chamberlain's appeasement in Munich was that it snuffed out whatever hope the Nazis' domestic opponents had for resisting Hitler. These included some high-ranking officials within the German military who had been considering a coup d'etat until Munich. Negotiation can also give the villain valuable attention in the media and elsewhere. It can also give him time to delay military intervention until he's strong enough to fight. That seems to have been one of Hitler and Stalin's key motivations for signing the shocking German-Soviet non-aggression pact in August 1939. Negotiation can also potentially set a dangerous precedent or perverse incentive. Well-meaning charities have found that when they've sought to save people from modern slavery by buying their freedom, that action can sometimes encourage slave dealers to go enslave others. Henry Kissinger tried to discourage his own kidnapping by ruling out negotiation up front for this very reason. He used to say that if he was ever abducted, he did not want the U.S. government to negotiate for his release, and if they got a message from him to the contrary, it meant that he was dead. Striking a deal with a villain can give him a public relations victory at no cost. There's some evidence that dictators readily sign human rights agreements so they can claim to be respectable. They sign knowing that they will not permit outsiders to hold them accountable. As Mnookin argues, various risks mean that you need to devote special care and attention when planning to negotiate with evil people. That includes setting strong accountability checks to make sure you're not being sucked in. It also means limiting your own authority, rotating negotiators, and staying in close touch with your constituents. As we saw in an earlier session, it can also mean using special arrangements to help assure yourself that your counterpart is not making false promises. But there's a danger, too, in ruling out negotiations with others we deeply disdain. If the call for peace and the desire for it means anything, they must mean at least considering the possibility of talking with enemies. As Mnookin notes, talking with someone doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with them. We may believe that our enemies are villains, and they may be. Yet surprisingly, there are many peace accords that have lasted even when trust was entirely absent, as we've seen previously. And when we consider the profound cost of violence and war, it adds new force to the call to at least consider the high and difficult challenge of negotiating with adversaries. A few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly led to nuclear war, John F. Kennedy gave a speech at American University where he called for reduced tensions with the Soviet Union through a nuclear test ban treaty. He ended that speech with both a warning and an expression of hope about military conflict. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert and try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not toward a strategy of annihilation, but toward a strategy of peace. Thoughts of frightening counterparts get at a natural fear we experience in negotiation. But it's not the only kind of fear we face. We also face fear when we're crossing over to negotiate with someone from another culture. That experience is often filled with special anxieties and threats that can destroy ventures, ruin peace initiatives, and even cripple families. Yet there are ways to overcome and triumph in the face of cultural differences, and often these ways can create hidden opportunities. We'll see how to better manage cross-cultural negotiations in our next session.